Hi, everyone. We're very happy to have Nishmeet Singh at this seminar today. He's a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, and he received a SPIA fellowship to work on a study looking at food choices in Tanzania. So today he will present this work, and we'll have an occasion to see the progress together. It's still some work in progress, right? The study is done together with the Fresh Initiative, the Fruit and Vegetable for Sustainable Healthy Diets. So we'll have 30 minutes for the presentation from Nishmi, then we'll have about 10 minutes of discussion from Monica, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. You're welcome to have especially clarification questions during the 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have even more time for discussion afterwards. Thank you. Nishmit, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rashid, and thank you everyone for having me here. I hope my voice is clear. So yeah, it's good to be here. And today I will, as Rashid mentioned, I will be talking about my research on food and food choices in the context of Tanzania. This project is supported by SPIA, so I'm very thankful for that. And it's still in its development stage. So I'm really looking forward to sort of your thoughts and comments and views on this and how we can sort of make some of this more concrete or rigorous in our approach, right? So that's the idea behind this. So if you think of food choices, right, we, along with people around the globe, spend a significant time thinking about food and making decisions related to food, right? So it kind of reflects the centrality of food in our in our everyday life, whether it's in the form of what to purchase or how to cook, or just the simplicity of eating, right? So it is very central to decision making in all our lives. So this research, which is a part of my PhD work on food choices, is an attempt to sort of unpack food in people's everyday lives, its roles, decision-making, and behaviors in the context of Tanzania. This is, as again was mentioned before, embedded in the CGIAR initiative of FRESH, or the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable for Sustainable Healthy Diets. That's the acronym, so it's embedded within that. And I will sort of go through and explain the project as well a little bit. So this is the presentation outline for today. I will explain the need for this research, give you a broad context, framing of food choice and the science around it and how research has evolved, and then go on to explain the context of East Africa and Tanzania, and then building on to embed FRESH in that context, and then talk about the goal and research questions, specifically focusing on what the SPIA Fellowship supports, and then outlining my research methods, wherein I think I will explain how we are approaching the questions that I'm trying to address. And so unfortunately, I don't have any results because still we're developing it, but this is where I think it will be useful to get your inputs. And then I will just finish off by explaining the activity timelines and how we are sort of looking forward to this project. So if you think very broadly, right, what I think of food choice as a system of interactions. So that's my conceptual lens, right? And it operates at multiple.
Nishmit, I'm wondering whether you are seeing we're still on the first slide in what we see. Are you on a different one?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were on the third slide. Sorry.
Is there a disconnection between what we see and what you see?
Yeah, I was looking at the third slide. Sorry. Let me try. I just stopped sharing. Let me try and share again. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
It's okay.
It
looked like you had an outline first, but
yeah, sorry. What about now?
Yeah, now we see your slides. Perfect.
You see the outline. So yeah, that's the outline basically. The gap,
that's okay.
the initiative, goal, research methods, and activity timelines. Do you see the slide now, right?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so I was talking about the framing of food choice and my conceptual lens, basically. So I see food choice as a system of interactions that is operating at multiple scales, whether you think of personal food choice or you think of a family food choice. There is a community that's embedded within the food choice. And then you have the interaction of at the global scale, at your city scale. So you can go from private to global. So I'm thinking of those interrelations and how that affects everyday lives of people in Tanzania. And I also think of it as not like a fixed system. It's not like a fixed or a dead system, but it's very dynamic, rich, full of life. And it's it plays out in every day in certain contexts at a certain point of time. So that's my sort of conceptual lens. And one of the ways that I found useful to sort of think through that is in the form of these three interconnected questions. So what do people eat? Again, based on what's available for them, what's accessible to them. And then this is, again, embedded within the food environment, the policy, the socio-cultural context of people, right? And if you look at it from a lens of the nutrition point of view, right? Which is the lens that I'm looking at. I'm looking at this from an interdisciplinary lens of nutrition and anthropology. So if you look at it from a nutrition lens, how do you measure it is basically through dietary intakes or food frequency surveys or food diaries, right? So that's the what aspect of it. In terms of how people consume food or how do they make the choice, there is this pattern or this behavior that's involved, right? So what to acquire, how to store when you have the food, how do you prepare? There are different ways in people prepare food, and it's all related to sort of the physical environment or the food environment as well. And then you have these family dynamics of how food is distributed, consumed, certain kinds of foods being consumed by certain family members first. What are those practices? So that's the how of the food science. And then you go to the why, which is around the decision making. And again, all of this, I think of it like a system. So it's interconnected, underlying logics of food choice, which is why it's called the drivers of food choice. It entails the preferences, the desirability. It could be personal or it could be family. And then the social cultural influence. So if you're living in a joint family or if you're living in a certain community, say in the Tanzanian context, there is you live in sort of ethnic groups together. So do you share food, or how food is produced? Is it produced sharely? And how do you celebrate a festival? So food again comes into you can take these various dynamics into the context, right? So that's how I'm thinking of it. Now, giving you a snapshot of the nutrition and food choice in the context of East Africa. And so what has happened is the East Africa and most of these countries have in the past, I think it's been 50, 60 years since these countries have decolonized. So there is an influence of colonization. And now over time, you see global products in the food market. So there is an influence of globalization. And in agriculture, you see development programs, international development programs coming in, international companies coming in. So there is that influence of neoliberalization policies as well, which have triggered this sort of transition in East Africa. And by transition, I mean there is especially in the urban context, you see overconsumption in calorific terms, and then there is a surge in the non-communicable diseases as well. But there is again a section of population, again this is just the regional context, so which still face hunger, and they don't have food, and they are inadequate in terms of their nutrition intake as well. So and so going beyond that, when you think about choices in the East African context, choices have become market dependent. As I said, there has been an influence of packaged and processed food coming into the markets, not just at the rural level, but also not just at the urban level, but in rural context as well, and which is we are getting indications that there is they're sort of swaying choices towards more processed and packaged food, as well as meals that are consumed outside home. Okay. So, and one of the sort of factors that have come up with sort of more market dependence, it has raised concerns about food quality and food safety, not just in the local food environment, but even beyond that, right? So that's also an emerging concern in this context. Sorry. So now when you think about food and food choice in Tanzania specifically, so I'm moving from East Africa to the context of Tanzania, overnutrition coexists with undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. Overweight, obesity, especially among women of caring age, as well as children and adolescents, has been rising. If you look at the figure, unhealthy diets, there is a signal that unhealthy diets have been contributing to malnutrition. So in the figure, you see the percentage of recommended intake and the food groups that are being consumed. You see red meat, how it's close to 200%. So people are over consuming red meat. And then there is an underconsumption of through healthy foods, basically vegetables, legumes, fruits, and dairy. So you see, and this is both rural and urban. And I can also tell you that, this is the kind of, this is the diets that we are we're seeing in the rural context as well. So if you talk about food choices, what's happening in Tanzania is women are still central to sort of preparing food, procuring food, preparing food, distribution. So they are basically the nourishers in the family. And what has happened is, as I was saying, in the rural areas as well, there is large market dependence. So if you look at that stat, basically 60% of food consumed in rural areas is coming from purchase, it comes from market purchases. So people are moving away from sort of own consumption to market dependency. That's the dynamic. And then in terms of the dynamics of choice, you're seeing that there is a cultural and social shift in people's preferences and utilization of fresh foods, especially among young people. So the dynamic is basically young people, when they see new vegetables and fruits, they are willing to try, especially women. They buy them, they try, and sort of with certain sort of inputs, they try and prepare them and serve them to the family. But the other desire is also sort of to purchase packaged foods and the exposure to sort of sweetened beverages or snacked food that's available in some of these markets. So there is some complexity or a trade-off in decision making that we're sort of looking at. And as I mentioned, in the context of East Africa, the safety concerns for fruit and vegetables and fresh fruit is also emerging. So if you look at the research gap, so I see it again, the research gap in terms of food choice is that sort of interplay between rural and peri-urban areas. Because as I said, with jobs more available in cities, people sometimes are moving to cities, in search for a job, but they don't get the job. This is settle in the outskirts, in the peri-urban spaces. Sometimes they settle in, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's a constant movement depending on the proximity to the city there. So it's creating this class of sort of migrant youth, which is constantly moving between cities. So we don't know really what is happening between that space, the continuum between continuum from rural to peri-urban, and also how it is evolving between own food consumption and market dependency. We are getting signals, but we really don't know what's actually happening. And specifically, we don't know the role of women. So how that is changing is also relatively unexplored. You can think about family cultures, the support that women provide, involvement of women in food production. and time use, juggling her time between home and work, how that's changing as well, we don't know. And there are relatively lesser number of sort of programs in Tanzania that have fully captured these dynamics, and subsequently program and impact studies on food safety behavior within this food choice dynamics related to behavior and perceptions also have been very few. So the fresh end-to-end approach, now I'll be talking about the FRESH project basically. So FRESH is a research initiative implemented in 4 countries, Benin and Tanzania in Africa, and the Philippines and Sri Lanka in Asia. In all countries, FRESH uses an end-to-end approach with the primary objective of increasing fruit and vegetable intake, while also aiming to reduce poverty, improve livelihoods, address issues related to climate change and environmental health, gender, youth, and social inclusion. So it's a very broad sort of objectives that the project is trying to achieve. And the starting point for FRESH is demand, which is where my project also fits in. In terms of demand, it is aiming to understand and influence diets and work back through the food system to address some of these issues related to supply and food environment. So it's trying to understand demand and then work through that to influence supply as well as the food environment. So that's the FRESH research initiative. And how it's sort of designed, it's designed as a longitudinal cluster randomized controlled trial in villages and peri-urban areas in 5 districts in the Arusha and Kilimanjaro regions. The objective, as I said, is to sort of assess over time. This is the outcome, basically, to assess over time changes in vegetable production as well as fruit and veg consumption and the impact of FRESH on the end-to-end approach basically on vegetable production and consumption. The sample size is around 2,800 households. So this is the FRESH study area. You can see Tanzania in the first figure, Tanzania and Africa. Then you look at the regions that we are working in blue, which is the Arusha and Kilimanjaro region. So this is northern Tanzania at the border of Kenya, basically. And then you see the 5 districts that the FRESH study area. So now I'll just talk about my research goal, which is supported by the SPEAR Fellowship, which is to gain insights into women's perspectives specifically. As I said, the role of women is changing dynamically. Women are still the nourishers of the family, but that role is changing within the dynamics of how there is that sort of, between rural as well as peri-urban areas and certain foods emerging or coming into these contexts. So to gain insights into women's perspective and drivers of food choice in the context of rural and peri-urban Tanzania, with an emphasis on choice behavior, intake, and safety of fruit and vegetable. So what I want to understand is within the FRESH project, why the change occurred. I think the quantitative surveys in FRESH will be able to capture the what is happening, but why the change occurred or why it did not, and then understand some of the mechanisms or everyday role of food in their lives with a focus on fruit and vegetable because it's embedded within FRESH. And then just to sort of get a deeper understanding of what's happening and how people are making these choices. So in terms of my research questions and methods, I mentioned both sort of my PhD research questions are here, and I highlighted the questions that I want to answer using the SPEAR Fellowship. So basically, the question is how and why women are consuming fruit and vegetable. And this will be answered through quantitative surveys with women of caring age, around 2,800 women spread across 5 districts. This quantitative survey or the baseline survey is currently happening in Tanzania, and where I've sort of designed a survey module on food choice that tries to understand food access and eating behavior. So I'm sort of I've tried to sort of get an overview through the quantitative surveys of how food is consumed and what's influencing eating behavior. And then for the focus of the SPEAR Fellowship, I attempt to do qualitative surveys with women of caring age, starting early next year. We're in the design phase of this, where I'm planning to do around 30 in-depth interviews, as well as 10 shopping trips. So this is a method that's comes from the visual ethnographic sort of discipline of ethnography, like anthropology in the form of visual ethnography, where you sort of basically with a respondent, you go and experience how in their journey to the market and their navigation in the market, basically. So, and then you try and understand if how they sort of make choices, how they select or not select certain kind of food, what influences their sort of purchasing behavior, basically. So that's the shopping trips. And then food safety I mentioned, but that's not part of the SPEAR thing, but I just mentioned it here. So this is the conceptual framework. Like I said, I want to sort of understand the interrelations with at the individual, personal, environment, and policy level. So through the surveys, I'll basically be aiming to get to two levels, individual and interpersonal, some aspect of environment as well, because I said that we're doing these shop along methods. So we'll be able to get, but policy, I think I'm aiming to get it through more sort of through more secondary sort of research. So just to give you a little more about insights into the drivers of food choice and what the qualitative research will try and do. Basically, part one is interviews with women, where we discuss personal and family food culture. We discuss their lived experience around food at the community level. We'll be discussing their interaction with the food environment, just to get to know the number of outlets they're purchasing from, the frequency, why are they purchasing basically from certain outlets, how do they navigate the space, and then understand the meaning and perception of food safety at home as well as in the food environment. And in the shop along interviews, which is or the food stories that we may do, the focus will be, again, like I said, so type degrees and type of engagement with vendors or retailers or in the markets, and then selection and non-selection of certain products, and how does sort of how is it how are certain food prioritized, whether it's family, personal, culture, seasonality, those aspects, and then negotiation strategies, right? So cost versus likes or preferences, or health versus desirability. So really getting into the whys, and we want to sort of document the voice of women, and the role of food in their everyday lives. The focus is on fresh foods, but we want to sort of try and document that, and eventually help the sort of the impact assessment, basically got the fresh evaluation to understand some of the pathways to impact and the mechanisms around it. So I just finished by talking about the activity for this, the activity timeline for this project. Basically, we are in the process of preparation of interview guides and protocols. And then early next year, I'll be in Tanzania setting up this research. We have 3 months to do it. So we will be constantly talking to the community, be in the community before even implementing these sort of implementing this qualitative work. We'll be preparing, we'll be doing pilots, and then eventually we'll be doing the interviews with women. And then after that, in the second half of next year, basically, second quarter, basically, we'll be doing the analysis, and then in the second half, we'll be sort of discussing this with the fresh team in DC. And then the final is the submission of the technical report to the SPEAR team. And all of this will be supported by the fresh initiatives. I mentioned the name of a few researchers that will be supporting it, especially Dr. Diana Only, who's sort of also my external advisor on the for my PhD, is also leading a fresh here. And we also have Tanzanian research partners in the World Vegetable Center and the University of Sokono, who will be also guiding me when I'm in Tanzania to help me understand the context a little better. So yeah, I will just finish here. Thank you so much for your time.
Right, thank you very much, Nishmeet, for the presentation. Monica, do you want to start the comments?
Yeah, hi. Hello, everybody. If you don't know me, I'm Monica Biradavodu. I'm a SPIA panel member, and I'm going to be talking from a qualitative perspective because that's who I am. I'm a qualitative sociologist. So as I'm listening to Nishmeet's presentation, I'm thinking about, okay, how is the qualitative study being framed? What are the details that I'm learning, and how best can we help Nishmeet to make this better than what I've heard, I suppose. First of all, I'm really delighted that there is a qualitative component, because oftentimes I think qualitative work is seen as kind of good to have, but not necessarily a necessary component of studies. So that I'm really happy that you are undertaking this kind of effort to hear people's voices, bring them in, talk to people, and see how people think about food. Because as you mentioned rightly, food is not just any old decision. It's very personal. It is linked to political and social and familial ties and relations. So my comments, really, there are only two main ones. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about those. One is an issue of sampling. I mean, now, of course, in qualitative studies, we don't think of sampling in the same way as we do in quantitative, right? We're not looking for representative samples. But I still urge people to think about the logic. What is the logic for the 30? Because you're talking about 5 pretty large districts, I would imagine. So how are you going to select the 30? And because qualitative is all about depth, right? So the whole purpose is, the goal is never breadth. It's about getting into as much detail as you can with the few people that you're going to get. So it's not that I'm asking you why only 30, like why not 40 or 50 or 100? That's not the question. The question is, how do you intend to decide who the 30 are? Because there's women, but I mean, that's too broad.
That's not one.
Yeah. So that's one question. And I think it's a good question overall, not just about your study, but I feel like it's a good thing to talk about in the sense of including it in presentations. So more and more people who listen to such presentations understand that it's not just randomly selecting people. Right? Mm-hmm. You're not just going to a market and say, hey, the first 30 women who show up, I'm going to talk to them. So there is a logic, and I'd like you to explain that logic a little bit more. And I think it should really be a part of presentations as well. So that's one. And the second is, how are the two linked? How is the quantitative and the qualitative, how are they speaking to each other? So that, if you can talk a little bit more about. I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure there'll be other questions. So those are two big picture questions that I had listening to your presentation.
Oh, thank you so much for this. And I'm glad that you brought this up. I did not include the sampling slide purposefully. It was because we're still thinking about it, and I didn't want to put out ideas that that are still in sort of development phase. And it's glad that you brought it up. So let me talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about it. And one of the ways that you've kind of mentioned is the quant and qual link also goes through sampling, right? Because the quantitative surveys are already in place. And as I mentioned, that I have a module that's trying to get quantitatively whatever you get about food choice. So I'm asking women about the markets they're purchasing from, the primary markets, the secondary markets, and other markets that they're purchasing fresh fruits from, but as well as other food as well, right? So I want to sort of get to that as well a little bit. And then I'm asking about their frequency. Do their sort of perceived sort of availability in these markets, if there is a main market in the village as well. So that's that's what will kind of feed into my sampling strategy. And based on the research objective that I currently have, I think one way that I want to sample is, of course, like, pick women from the rural context as well as the peri-urban context, because that's the dynamic that I want to bring out. So I will definitely have that kind of like, layer of stratification, if you can call it that way. So I will definitely have pick sample from there. And then the other, sorry,
yeah. The only reason I'm interrupting is just to say, to add to that, because again, it's all about depth, and that's strength, to bring in things that you wouldn't necessarily think of, because food choices are, there's women, the usual suspects, right? Class, and in the context of Tanzania, it may be ethnicities, it may be other things. I mean, in Indian context, I would say caste. It's huge, right? Like it determines everything, particularly food. So what are those characteristics of populations that really tell you which foods are preferable or not, or how does that play in? So I would definitely keep that in mind as you're looking at your quantitative results.
Sure. Definitely. I was also trying to sort of the other way we wanted to sample, or it was an idea to look at like, the family dynamics as well, because we have questions related to eating behaviors, where we ask about like, who's responsible for preparing food? Are you the only person responsible for preparing food? And then like, how is food distributed? Do men eat first, like I mentioned, or do women eat first? So some of those elements we will try and feed into like, our sampling strategy as well. And then also looking at like, because the fresh sample, I don't know if I mentioned, fresh sample actually includes the women who have an adolescent in their household. So basically that's the eligibility for the fresh quantitative surveys. So, and then you could have like a larger family, if you have more members, if you have, say, an elder in the family, sometimes he or she is the influencer as well. So you can look at nuclear families, vis-a-vis joint family dynamics as well. And the final thing that I want to say on this is like, in terms of looking at not just like, people who are buying from markets, that's another thing that I want to look at is like, when people say, for example, if they move to peri-urban areas, do they still have a plot of land that they're consuming, that they're using for self-consumption? I know there has been work done on nutrition gardens and home gardens and all of that, but the context here may be different, because I was in Tanzania like, 3-4 weeks ago, and I noticed that, some of these women, they have home gardens or home, like, at the back of their house, and basically they also have a kiosk in the front. So basically they would be using some of these produce to also sell, right? So they don't lose out on like, land or own consumption, even when they move to peri-urban areas, right? So the market dependency versus the own garden, and how does that support nutrition and food is another aspect of it.
I have one other suggestion, then I'll stop. So it's when I was taught qualitative methods, and sometimes this doesn't work in a context where you have to determine, because there's budget and time constraints. Given that you will be there for some time, you can think about doing interviews. Each one is a case. Ideally, ideally what you want to do is you interview one, that person is a case. And that person contains within themselves all the characteristics of the case. And then you slowly build a narrative. And each case that you add on, it's like, I don't know, layers of a lasagna, if you will. So by the end, you have the full picture, but you don't start out very predetermined that these are the 30 I must get. You have, the great thing is you have flexibility. So if you hear new information, because there's so much, even as you're talking, there's just too many variables. There's peri-urban, urban, there's adolescent, there's ethnicity, there's class, so what do you do with so much and with your time? So I would encourage you to think about, and not maybe think about the interviews and the shopping things as distinct, because you can combine them and actually do more as with 40 interviews. rather than, and with each person, it can be a shopping trip and a conversation. So I don't know. I didn't quite.
It is presented as disconnected, but eventually, when I'm there, I will get a sense of it. It could definitely be connected, and you can, like you rightly mentioned, again, very useful to think of each person or each sort of household as a case, and then the other thing that I've been thinking just to mention that, because we mentioned shopping, is also about food preparations and eating, right? So if I'm there, if I could sort of observe, some of this can also be coming from participatory observation methods, right? I don't have to do interviews. So that's another element that I've been thinking about. So it's in there, but very useful again to think of that as each sort of interview or each sort of household as a case in itself, and how do you go about it? Yes, thank you very much, Monica. Very useful. Thank you very much.
Sure. Rashid, I will turn it over for the open questions. I'm sure Nishmeet will.
Thank you so much, Monica. Let's open the floor. Anyone has a question? Maybe while people find inspiration, let me, if you want, I had one or two questions or comments. The first one is, the main one is, perhaps as an economist, and that is a field of perspective distinction, I kind of struggle with how broad it is and how general it is, and setting such a broad question makes it look like an impossible task, because you have to sort of categorize, understand the full consumption pattern, and perhaps connected to this, how broad it is, I don't see very explicit the so what do we do with this, and perhaps this is a bit of the SPIA hat and a bit of the the perspective from really whether we're interested in agriculture, and it looks like there is some idea of we want people to eat healthy, and how do we help people eating healthy, and perhaps getting an increasing, especially if you have some way of capturing the dynamics, not only sort of picture of the moment, but how this seems to have been evolved through, even if you ask it at one moment, but you ask a bit how it has changed over time. That would be interesting. Are they actually getting away from healthier food towards more processed food? And talking about unhealthy habits, for example, I think the figure that you showed, which shows that they tend to consume twice more red meat than recommended, is really striking, because we have some prejudice, probably some preconceived ideas that they are the main issues to be undernourished for at least some chunk of the population, and the fact that at least for some of them, at least on average, there is some overconsumption of red meat, and that seems double what's recommended. That seems huge. Now, I'm sure if you show the US, it would be like at least 5 times what's recommended. So everything is relative, and we know that the actual recommendation should be quite low. But it is a striking fact. And does this kind of intriguing fact help us think of, in some way, the ideas that even given their budget, they may, and we don't be judgmental in terms of taking the right decisions, but in some cases, taking decisions that could be harmful for the health of their children and their family. And is that the final objective, or is more simply sort of observational? I saw Niels raised his hand, so please go ahead if you have any brief answer, and then we'll ask Niels.
Thanks very much, Rashid.
Sorry, Niels, I was just saying, perhaps let's give Nishmeet a brief moment to answer this question, and then you can come next, if that works.
Yeah. So again, thank you, Rashid. I think and let me explain my position as well, because I was trained in economics. Okay, so I have a bachelor's and master's in economics, and now I've moved to a PhD where I've taken up this challenge of sort of doing qualitative work alongside quantitative surveys. So I completely understand your question in terms of how does it matter, or why does it matter, right? And let me give you a very specific example in this context. Like you said, right, red meat is sort of consumption. We saw that from the figure, right? It's twice. where it's also like, you know, the meals like that are eaten outside home, right? Of course, red meat could be a part of this, but it's also like, you know, people are, and especially young people, they're consuming a lot of snacks, fried chicken, and like, you know, other stuff, packaged stuff outside the food. It's not completely transition. So that's where I want to, like, you know, that's where I think the Fresh project also comes in, because we currently do not see a majority that's been sort of like, you know, moved towards that spectrum of unhealthy food consumption. We're seeing that pattern emerge, and that's where we want to understand what is influencing from a people's perspective. That's the, at least the project, like, you know, from my perspective, that's the idea that I want to get at. Why? And then how Fresh uses it is their thing, of course, right? Like, you know, they are trying to influence. Maybe they have thought of any, like, you know, consumer choice, consumer behavior interventions. I don't know, but I want to give them, like, you know, why this is happening, and then they can design interventions around it. So, and then specifically on one thing is around food safety element, right? Because as people sort of like, you know, this isn't this again, this, if in economics term, or like, you know, a general term that we throw away, is like informal markets, right? So these markets are very, very informal. The safety regulations don't exist, right? Or they're not fully functional. They exist, but they're not fully functional. Apologies. So how does that happen when you buy fresh food, right? So as we are looking at it, like you know, in this context, again, what I have observed, and also what is coming up in conversations when I talk to people, is that, like, you know, when the people move closer to the cities, they're still relying on the rural, sort of their rural connections for fresh food. So they're not fully sort of, again, buying from supermarkets, because the packaging, the label, the certification of safety doesn't exist, right? They want to consume, but so what happens is eventually they stop consuming. If they lose that rural connection, they stop consuming the fresh food, and they sort of like, you know, they start consuming more packaged stuff. So that's the dynamic that's emerging. So which is where I think the intervention of the project will come in and sort of like, you know, pause that a little bit in terms of sway diets towards healthy diets, like, you know. So that's like, you know, those are my thoughts on that.
Okay, great. Niels, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much. Yes, I also find it very interesting, and I also would like to support Monica in that it is great that there is also support and interest in qualitative studies, and especially linking quantitative and qualitative studies, and this whole setup looks really promising. So I just want to build on, because I mean, probably many of us have similar observations. I just want to build on what Monica and Rashid have already mentioned, that on the sampling, when we try to do something in qualitative surveys or data collections, it's the variation we're looking for, not the representativity. That we look for extremes, and so that we can see all the different aspects which might be interesting. And to understand what the extremes are, of course, you can go around and ask people what are really distinct diets or distinct decision makings or distinct categories, but you can also use your quantitative data which you already have. And I mean, this is the great opportunity that now you're collecting your quantitative data, and you can subject that to all kinds of torture to get out different types of categorizations of decision-making and diets and locations and producers, all market access, all these aspects. You can already look at your quantitative data and then get a feel of what type of respondents am I actually could I be looking for? Where could I expect real variation? But of course, you should keep your open mind, and what Monica said about flexibility. If you hear of something which is really interesting, that they say, these people up there, they eat really differently, you should jump at that and follow that up. The other part, which Rashid mentioned about why do we do this, I think you could be much more specific. I have the same worried stomach ache about trying to understand a huge topic like decision making on food. we will never understand it. We will not be able to simulate it. There are so many aspects to it. But if we can focus on an aspect which is more important for us all, especially for your initiative, that's the change in decisions. If you could, rather than just looking at the status quo, you could look a little bit at what they were eating. And you already hinted at that with your move from rural to peri-urban, how that has affected change. You could generalize that a bit more. How has the diet of people been changing? What role do fruit and vegetables take in this change? What do we see as opportunities for accelerating a positive change? What are barriers to positive change? What are sort of other changes going on? In fact, you focus much more on the dynamics of decision-making, food intake. Yeah, I think that would enable you to put a focus which is can then link back to many other things which are going on. And finally, one aspect which you didn't mention, but which we generally think is really important, is the temporal aspect of food intake and decision-making. Over the course of the year, between years, it might be that you, of course, know that and consider that, but it makes food decisions much more difficult, but it should be somehow considered. That's all for me. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Niels. Yeah, these are, again, very, very useful suggestions, and definitely I'd be thinking more about that and trying to sort of, like, like you mentioned, like capture the dynamics a little more, and help the project, like, through this work, I think. Yeah, thank you very much, I think.
Any other question?
No questions. A comment that I really second what Neil said about that kind of focus, because the switch from the peri-urban, the migrancy, that kind of population, those dynamics would make it a much more narrower, but also interesting, because it is a very dynamic moment in time that you're capturing. So yeah, just second that.
Definitely. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Nishmeet, for sharing your advance and for people to listen and provide some feedback. Thank you so much, Monica, for reviewing it and providing your feedback.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. This was great, and the comments have been very useful. Hopefully, we'll come back in a while and present some of this as well again.
I'm definitely looking forward to hear the progress and where this goes. I think, as Monica has mentioned, we are this joining qualitative and quantitative work is something that we are very interested in SPIA to sort of work on this together and have some at least some good examples of how this can be done and see how this could actually contribute to getting practical lessons and learning. So it's great that you're working on this, Nishi.
Thank you so much, Rashid. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.